Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome back, Grid Mod Pod listeners. Today, I'm very excited about this topic. It's a new topic that we really haven't opened the door to specifically, and it's about the telecom world and the importance of what is happening with the grid and how it communicates to each other, very high level. So I'm excited to have Alice today kind of dive into this and really bring to light the importance of this backbone that we all really rely on every day to keep our lights on. So with that, Alice, welcome to the Grid Mod Pod. I look forward to the discussion today. Why don't you give a introduction of yourself and we'll get started.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you to the Grid Mod Pod, to AEIC, to having me this morning. So just a bit of a background. I'm Alice Moy-Gonzalez, the Senior Vice President of Strategic Development at Anterix. A little bit about our company and the work that we're doing with utilities. We own 900 megahertz licenses nationwide. That is basically wireless spectrum that utilities acquire to build out their private broadband wireless network. As you said, the telecom topic is not something that is typically talked about on your show. So it's really great to have it. As you said, you're excited, and I'm equally excited about that. Why? It's because it's such a strategic element of the foundation of grid transformation that not everyone realizes. And the urgency around it, it's becoming much more important. So with any wireless network that utilities will build to get greater visibility of their system and higher reliability, this is usually a foundational asset that they would acquire. So we are very happy to have that discussion with you today.
And so, one thing I like to do is really, when we think about especially learning anything new, is the importance of understanding where we've come, where we are, fundamentally where we're headed, and then really is it where we ought to be. Brings in, various perspectives and understandings of kind of the base logic for really any topic, right? So when we think about the grid and the evolution of the grid, at the same time that the scientists and engineers were developing how to produce an electron flow. My mother told me I'm not allowed to say create energy because technically you can, but I was more, anyway, that we had to be able to create a way of communicating from one destination to the other. So at the same time was telecom, really how to, have the gentleman pick up a phone call and dispatch to the others. And so that has evolved over time. And we went from hundreds of devices that were interconnected, and then fiber came into our world, where we then advanced into SCADA. So now we have almost near real-time data for transmission. And then as we've evolved into the world of Wi-Fi, now we're getting to a space where we have millions, if not the reality will be billions of assets that have the capability to communicate to each other. So being in your space, right? What do you believe, knowing what we just kind of discussed, is the outlook for the industry in really 2025 and beyond? So, what do you think some of the key operational challenges and opportunities are? So we'll start high level.
Yeah. So really at a high level, Elizabeth, just as you pointed out, utilities have been using telecom systems for many years, but it is changing because of some of the complexities that they're faced today. Now, the need to continuously have informed grid strategies. What are the big things that are happening on the grid? You're integrating DER, you have new data centers that are coming online, so the grid needs to be more flexible. So the systems that you connected to before that needed communications, it's really growing, right? So taking that fundamental grid strategy and then layering on why you need communications, it really encourages every utility to think about what is that first step and the urgency around taking that first step to ensure that their comprehensive grid strategy, which includes telecommunications, can be a reality. So touching on data, you hosted a great workshop, actually a 2-day workshop. Day 1 was on data. Day 2 was on communications. So I think everyone is having a greater awareness of the relevance of data, having it in near real time, it being interoperable, because it's not just because it's cool to have data, right? Everybody's talking about data and AI, but what outcomes is it bringing? So if you have an outage that you're measuring in days, that now could be reduced into hours or if not minutes, right? You're seeing the benefits of getting that data. However, if that data is coming into your systems, right, and you have all of it coming from multiple places, that is coming in from your devices that it's connecting to. And oftentimes that pathway of where the data is starting from and where it ends up, there's not enough conversation that you're transporting it in a reliable, secure manner. And as you said, in near real time, so you could take actionable insights on it. I think about that saying of you can't improve, but you can't measure, right? Which is what
Love
data
it.
is.
Which is what data will give us. That
Right.
baseline performance. Like, let's all focus there before we talk about all of this nirvana of like virtual power plants and customers being, engaged to you know, be able to track their pizza. Like, can they track their electron? We need to learn how really get the basics, baseline our current systems. Yeah.
Exactly. So then when you break it down from that aspect, and then you understand the importance of having that pathways to communication, on one hand, if you don't think about it holistically, it could be a challenge to the grid operators. So we're actually working with 7 utilities across 15 states today that are in various stages of building out their private LTE broadband networks to give them greater situational insights into just about every device that needs to be connected on the grid so they could take real-time actionable changes to effectively monitor and control the grid, that it's effective from an operational standpoint, but also allowing you to have safe operations. So as you talked about 2025 and beyond, right? If I were to predict, I would think that whatever you think your data needs would be at that point in time might be at least 4 times. And then you compound that with the need for AI, right? That is improving your operational efficiencies. That would be more of an exponential growth over time. So I believe you'd see many more utilities following in those footsteps that have already taken communications as a more holistic approach. And also, Elizabeth, let's not forget, I think communications has been a conversation that only a few within the utilities understood, right? So you're going from electrons to data and flow. However, because it's touching so many parts of your organization to make it reliable, resilient, and secure, now you need the executives and the operational teams to come together to have that holistic strategy.
Kind of pulling out for those that may not be meshed into the telecom or the grid perspective. When we think about kind of early on, originally we had like very basic the phone calls, right? Where you literally were like putting pegboards to like link up certain lines of communication. And that has definitely evolved. So has many systems design and adaptability and various forms of maturity from really the end to end. So, when we're talking here, right, we're talking there's this certain spectrum, and actually the last 2, I think, episodes, we talked about the gap, the visibility gap, but from the substation to the edge. And so that's the focus of kind of where you sit. But knowing the reality is, that decision, that last, what do you guys call it? The last
Mile.
the last mile, has to be a part of the conversation in this long-term strategic priorities. There's also, your fiber systems there. What are you actually using today? How is that evolving? And, other components of the end-to-end communications. And so I guess, from my experience, I myself was very focused on, well, the data's there. I want the data. And very quickly I was told, well, our highway is not large enough. You want a 6-lane highway. We have a 2-lane highway, and we're not going to bring that much data back. And then I was like, well, let's just make the highway bigger. And very quickly I learned, well, that is a huge additional work stream that you need dedicated experts and workers and resources to really prioritize executing that plan. And I think, we've all gotten so excited about data that we must be talking about this. So, this phenomenon, fail to plan to fail, how, so, you kind of spoke of it a little bit, but how do you advise your utility leaders that you're working with, and really just how do we as champions of change or us innovative spirits craft this comprehensive telecommunication strategy? So what are the characteristics that you would talk through or like bring to light?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And fail to plan to fail, Elizabeth. When you think about when plans are presented, as you said, a highway, right? Going from a 2 lane to 4 lane to 6 lane, depending on what state you're in, it takes time to build. Sometimes every time you make that change, it's even more hard, right? To get to those different stages. So if you're just a highway developer without explaining what is the purpose of that highway, sometimes you don't get things moving forward. So similarly, with a lot of these plans that may be presented, you may see that it takes a very elongated time before a decision is made, or no decision is made at all. And when you really dissect that, one of the key challenges we've seen is the folks around the table that need to make that decision sometimes don't understand the criticality of how, one, the telecommunication strategy may be linked to the grid transformational strategy. That is changing. However, I think there's still more work that should be done. And the reason is I think we get excited, and you could also hold me back when we talk about telecom, and we could get very deep into the technology, right? But if you don't change it into the narrative that the rest of the organization that needs to be involved in that decision, you oftentimes see that these plans get stuck. So, on one hand, I'm thinking about the why, right? Why are you doing this? Change the narrative towards that, but also think about the who, right? Who are you speaking to? Who needs to be involved? Which again was some of the conversation that you had at that workshop. So knowing that you're building these telecom systems or your highways that are secure and reliable for your operational needs, bring the operational leaders together as early as you can. Your COO, your area presidents, right? Because you need to align with that corporate strategy. The CFO, what is the financial implications of the cost and the benefits of moving forward in this direction? Data strategists, and let's not forget regulatory folks to be involved.
I just love that you brought up the who, because I always am the one to bring up the who. So I love it, Alice. And, and what we mean, listeners, so typically the telecom or the communication is a blend of operational folk. So you have, field operation labor, physical employees that are effectively maintaining and ensuring the actual physical piece of hardware are working. They're the ones that commission any new devices, ensuring the communications there. You have SCADA engineers that are the ones that are ensuring that you're bringing in the feed, you're tying into the models, and then the operations, the ones that are actually in the control room, kind of making the decisions of how the grid operates. Those are 3 subgroups. And there's sometimes a blend of the ownership of the fiber and the Wi-Fi and the various communication streams fall under your IT, your, information systems. And so a big transformation that's happening in our industry is this IT OT convergence, but it's really the awareness of the distinct responsibilities of those 2 groups. The idea isn't that they should be absorbed together and then one unit. It's that we need to be more aware of what those 2 units do and who are the ones being held accountable, and ultimately who's the one that can fundamentally drive the strategy based on the technical challenges and outlay. So what does that mean is you could potentially have the SMEs that understand the greatness and the importance of ensuring our highways are larger and secure and reliable. But how do you communicate effectively to the CIO and to the COO while also this touches, as you stated, a big compliance and regulatory arm? So this phenomena is not really fundamentally under full operations, so you need that executive alignment. You need the perspectives and the parties in the room to understand the importance of this transformational change. So I love that you brought it up. And so I guess, thinking about your journey and working with the utilities that you have, and just, what in the utility, and knowing, the personality of the utility, or like it has a personality, I don't know. Because really strategies are long term. And I think we as a society have really got fixated, or maybe we're just acclimated to very quick turnarounds and short-term execution. But this is truly a long-term, by studying it, designing it, implementing it, and then prioritize the funding, and then getting the adequate workforce, right? So what are the kind of key milestones that you think could be stakes in the ground for a utility that's pursuing this comprehensive strategy?
Yeah. Well, I think that, first of all, you have to think about a telecom strategy as being fully integrated into the grid strategy, as opposed to one that's bolted on. So early on, as you said, think about who should be at the table and why, right? And then, if you go through this journey, and thankfully we've gotten great insights from the utilities that we've worked with and what worked really well for them. Bringing those stakeholders, like we called out before, to that table early and often, so that the telecom team was not the only one that's championing these ideas. It actually was to enable what's happening on the grid. So let's say you have an issue on the grid 3 years from now that you're working on. If you don't bring all of these stakeholders to the table, it's hard to do so. So I think of it as 4 key milestones or 4 paths. It may not be always in a serial pattern, but think of it as on-ramps. The first one is just identifying your corporate strategy, that your telecom strategy would be a key foundation for, right? So is it resiliency? Is it integrating DER? I think what you see is that you have common factors across all utilities, but if you're out west, for example, you may be focused on wildfire mitigation. Other states are saying it's not an if, but a when, right? So identify what that corporate strategy is and what your executives on those teams would be asking about. How could I have greater control, greater situational awareness, greater cybersecurity, getting data from all of these applications?
And those 3 that you just listed are kind of fundamental and not unique to the particular geographical or maturity of certain technologies. Like those are baseline performance needs of the existing grid. And I think I just want to footnote that, right? Like as industry leaders, like there's so many new or drivers that some humans could latch onto and disagree that they may be a reality. So if we could focus on, as an industry, that we're talking about what you said, baseline performance, like reliability, resilient, right? Secure communication systems to talk to the system that exists, opens that visibility gap that we have. Like 70% of most outages that customers observe are that last mile. So, having that data of the current system's performance is really powerful. But you also then have to have, I guess, your buckets of drivers. But I just wanted to carve that out. Like every utility cares about that 70% of their outages. How can they make them better?
Yeah, and think about what's changing, right? You had information that was coming into centralized systems that are now intelligence is going towards the edge. So
Right.
then data needs grow even more. So even if you took just those 3 buckets of corporate needs, Elizabeth, and you expand that out, each one of them may represent dozens, if not more, of use cases. So applications that you have thousands of devices connected to for each individual use case that you need real-time visibility on. So bringing the operations team then together in looking at, you said, as a strategy. So today, what you're connecting to, what may happen 3 to 5 years from now, and then 10 years from now, right? If you could at least, you may not have all of the accuracy related to 10 years from now, but right, some of those needs will just be compounded over time. And knowing the use cases really drive into developing a business case,
Right.
right? So now you're able to identify not just the cost of your system, but also the benefits of moving in this direction. What can I get in benefits that I did not have before? As we said, reduced outages as being one example, but also can I reduce my current O&M spending from what it is today, right? One of the first utilities we worked with, that's Ameren, talked about having 14 disparate networks that they did a study on because the grid mod program was identifying a number of different use cases they would be bringing online. And those 14 disparate networks would have grown to 20 something in order to accommodate their future needs. So they step back and look at, do I continue doing what I'm doing? Or do I look at a different approach that could cover my enterprise needs? And they realized that they could have collapsed many of those networks onto this private LTE network, which was standards-based, right? So that standards-based technology allowed them to benefit from innovation over time, scale because it's a global standard and a number of vendors that support you. So building that business case is important. But the fourth step in that journey of decision making is really getting back to your stakeholders, right? So now that you've done your work, thinking about what type of questions they would have and how you use all of the analysis that you've done from your corporate strategy, use cases, business case, to then inform your finance person, what's the cost, benefit, O&M savings, your regulatory right leaders. Why am I changing from what I have before?
Right. It's like our biggest challenge is communicating why the change, right?
Exactly. So think about those leaders. So, that's the sequencing or the key steps, Elizabeth, that I think will be fundamental in
I
building
just
those.
want to break them down, so one thing, to those that are wondering how can they support or help the electric utility industry, transform, adapt, move faster, right? There's this continuous inertia that utilities aren't adapting quickly enough. And so what you just talked through is something that is not taught in school, and it's not taught even if you're an independent consultant working outside the utility. The amount of labor and love that is required of an internal champion to see a very large system that's going to cost, yes, a large amount of customer, dollars or investor dollars or whoever's dollars they are, as well as typically the person that sees the issue. It's seen by others, but the amount of effort to, one, if you're in charge of the network, your job is to maintain it 24/7, 365. So you have that constant stress. So how do you find an ally or another individual that can help champion the development of the thought leadership? So the use cases, that requires pen to paper, writing it down. That requires putting numbers to ideas to quantify financial benefits as well as create, all of the safety, reliable, and secure benefits. That then takes you into, you know, doing these cost benefit analyses, which is a catch-22 to all of you listeners, because if you don't have the systems in place or you have not experienced it yet, it's very hard to quantify and be a fortune teller of the benefit. But the value of sharing that there's 7 utilities actively pursuing that, like we as an industry love to share. So, but then the next step is, now that you even said it, you're like, now you have your business case. Now you have to go in and you have to pitch it, not only to those 4 executive leaders that we just spoke of, but then get into the external stakeholders, and they're all asking, well, why now? Why change it now? And so you're up against many perspectives and personalities that have the power to say no. So when you have that many folk that can say no, we as a society have to realize, how do we help the one that's trying to make them say yes? So like help draft the use cases, help quantify the cost benefit, write, the business cases. Like these are documents that can be shared, and like it's, some say so do the utilities work, but it's like, if we're going to watch 3,000 individuals try to champion 3,000 utilities like strategy, that's going to take a long time. But as a unified thought leaders of the industry, how can we do that? And I just want to put it out there that I think you guys, in your journey and your support that we heard, especially at the workshop, like there's value in that vendor partnerships too with the utility and taking that for what it is. So I think we talked around the other area that would pop up, you get all the way and then it'd be like, well, is it secure? Like, what about our cybersecurity? So how have you, what do you mean by like this idea? And I think I've heard you say is building cyber in from the ground up, right? So, when people think telecom, they automatically think, well, is this going to be secure? Because now there's an enormous amount of data, and how are we going to protect it? So, what are those kind of key considerations to take into?
So, first of all, let me take a step back. We're talking about security built in from the ground up for private networks. So, utilities have the opportunity to build out their wireless infrastructure. So, think about the towers and the antennas that are transmitting using standards based technology.
Just to quantify. So we are talking about, if you want to execute down this path, yes, you will have to build physical towers and various pieces of hardware. Yes. Okay.
Yes, that is correct. And the hardware that you're getting actually is LTE technology. So many people are familiar with it because they use it. I mean, I think about my phone, right? You're carrying it around. The big difference is you're using wireless spectrum that you would have accessible to you, licensed, that you own these assets from the infrastructure, the pathways that it's communicating on with the spectrum to that end device. So end-to-end control. Why is that so important to have that control? It's because it's connecting into your grid where the electrons are flowing. So think about the network as an extension of your grid assets. You have the ability to build it in a way that you have the same level of control and resilience and security of your grid assets itself, right? So when we say building security from the ground up, really is because as you build those networks, you're building it to your standards. NUC, for example, utilities are looking at that, and also, establishing what type of inherent security technologies are available from this LTE standard that they're able to bring in. So, of course, we talk about encryption, multi-factor authentication. These are standard that you could build in. However, if you're putting in even greater reliability and security practices, it's where the utilities are coming together. And I would say not doing it alone. There's some work that we do with the DOE labs, with EPRI. Also, we've launched actually a couple years ago, our Anterix Security Collective. So we have an ecosystem of over 125 members. A subset of them are very focused on cybersecurity. So any vendor that would become part of this end-to-end utility-owned communications has additional layers of security to protect that data. One of the areas of focus is supply chain security validation. And really, what was that? I was really intrigued when I learned about it, because you're ensuring the integrity of your data, integrity of the suppliers and vendors that come onto that network. You go through a badging process so that you ensure that any components on that utility grid, and by extension, a communications network, has been vetted with certain best practices as you go through. So, knowing that you could identify if there's any counterfeit components on your network or unauthorized users gives you the ability to do that. So building it with the utility has the control over it. You're able to build in your utility grade standards, and also that would be coupled with the LTE technology. But again, I'm really excited about the work we're doing under our Anterix Active Security Collective and the programs that we run to give that additional layer of security to the utility.
Very informative. So, it's like a part. I love it. Because I think a lot of people just kind of like, we're building the grid out, we're making it more, digitized, we're going to enhance it. Everyone's focused on the wires and the poles and the physical grid assets. It's almost the same thing as like when you're building out this spec, you're incorporating all of it. It's not going to be an afterthought. So kind of the statement you had earlier about building the grid out with telecom embedded, it's almost, when you're doing that, you're embedding this type of cybersecurity into the already established system. So it's not an afterthought for any of those
Correct.
that are hesitant out there. So, just thinking about, the historical legacy models, and really, when it comes down to it, it's people, right? So the technology is available. It's been proven. I think a lot of industry that is working to enhance or advance the electric utility space can all say that, like, we have the technology, it's proven, it's vetted. But when it comes down to it, it's, the people. And, wires, like, it's always been wires. Telecom is like the wires to talk to the substation. It was almost a support function to the larger group. And I think, having you on today, and something that I'm going to continue to speak to and really boil up to the top, is that we need it to be integrated. The conversation is not one or the other, it's the both, and the capabilities of all should ensure that you're bringing your IT team along. And something we talk about a lot is also in the power industry is, our workforce, right? And the evolution of, where's the talent pool? Currently, I think just like our aging workforce of electric utility, the telecom specialists are all averaging late 40s into their 60s, with a very small percentage of younger generation, like the 20s and 30s, in this space. So I think there's also this driver, right? This human need to have the discussions, to build up the power systems background, the telecom background. They typically come, IT, electrical, computer information kind of is the background of most telecoms. Tell me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of, the journey and their perspective, gets channeled. So I guess, thinking, kind of wrapping up, like the human element, right? How do we bring, really the need for this new workforce, the talent pool, the awareness of the technology to the table of the decision makers? And those decision makers can sit in quite a few areas, but really to have that conversation. So I guess, you've been having these conversations probably for the last several years. Like, what have you seen key points or key approaches that have really resonated when bringing this topic to the table?
I think the narrative is important when you consider the champions that you called out that should be at the table. The telecom team understands this pretty well, and the urgency around making this decision. There's a tendency, though, we could talk about bits and bytes and hertz and latency in milliseconds and lose people very, very quickly, right? So going back to the why, really having a new lexicon. If you go back to what are the savings this is bringing, or what are the operational benefits? I'm going to leave you with a quick story where I remember we had a mix of executives and also telecom IT folks in the room talking about the relevance of making this decision. So it went into a very deep technical conversation until one of the executives looked a little bit glazed over from the utility, but, respectfully smiling. And we paused for a second and said, do we understand what we're talking about? And the request was, actually, if we could break it down a little bit, would be super beneficial. So the conversation a few years ago was, some devices were deployed on what was 3G technology on a public carrier network that was end of life. That needed to be replaced. A truck roll was associated with it. So as a result, 6,000 devices were connected in that manner because they had no control over their network. It was not one that was utility owned. Those 6,000 devices was approximately $1,000 in truck rolls. That's a $6 million cost that was not accounted for because they had no control on that network. So it went from a technical conversation to how does this impact me from a budget? Also, right, this is not efficient for my operations. The great thing, Elizabeth, is utilities are very collaborative and would share their best practices. whether it's opportunities and challenges along the way. So what I would encourage anyone is to talk to others, right? Engage. The workshop sessions that you're doing would be super phenomenal, and to continue that conversation. So they could get not just the technical information related to this topic, but also think about, right, from a regulatory side, if they're working within the NERUC environment, finding what filings other utilities have presented. All of these are great artifacts to help other utilities that are in different phases of their journey to accelerate, one, the decision, if they haven't made a decision to create a strategy yet. And then secondly, if they have already decided to embark on it, right, how could they benefit from a whole ecosystem, a community of support in driving these benefits forward? So the quicker you put those networks up, of course, is the quicker you get those benefits that we talked about.
So I heard a lot, in regards to it cannot be just one, right? You need a team of aligned leaders to really explore, this strategy and really champion it and then execute it. So it's very insightful. And, to our listeners, we explored this shifting landscape, which we do. I mean, that's the essence of the Grid Mod Pod, but the importance of telecommunication in our modern grid operations. And we need to be evaluating both phenomena, both infrastructures, because they are truly integrated. And so is the talent behind it, right? So, Alice, I think you did a great job of clarifying to the why that we need to do this comprehensive long-term strategy. It's not a luxury, it's like a necessity, right? So thank you so much for showing up today, your passion and expertise. And I love the who and the why and the when and the how that you brought up through this conversation. I look forward to continuing this journey with you. So
Same here, Elizabeth. Well, thank you. I think I fed off of your energy. So thank you for bringing it this morning and the opportunity here to speak on the Grid Mod Pod. Keep doing great work.
Thanks.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.